Okay, so just want to say thank you to everybody who is attending. Um, what I would want to ask everybody to do is if you're not speaking, to mute your phones. We want to make sure that there aren't any distractions during Mr. Harrington's presentation. So I'll go ahead and read his very, very interesting bio. And then once I'm done reading his bio, the floor will be his to give his presentation. Lonnie Harrington was born in Tallahassee, Florida in 1952. With his mother, he moved to Dania. I hope I'm saying that right.
Dania.
Dania in 1957 to live with his maternal grandmother. It was here that his mother would take him on visits to the Dania, now Hollywood, Seminole Reservation. He came to New York City in 1959, where his mother had relocated. He would spend the summers of 1960, 61, and 62 in Dania and would live there from August 63 through June of 64 when he returned to New York City. While attending Hunter College in New York City from September 1970 through June of 1972, he established a foundation which led him to research interactions between Native Americans and African Americans. Already performing with local rock bands in the city as a singer, songwriter, guitarist, and percussionist, he relocated to Boston in February 1973 to perform with soul and R&B bands performing throughout the Northeast and Eastern Canada. He returned to New York City in December 1976. In April 1977, he joined the program staff of the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs. In September 1979, he was one of 3 agency liaisons to a fledgling arts and education organization called Arts Connection. Officially, he joined the staff of this organization in September 1981 and would work through June of 2018. All during this time, he had a parallel career as a musician, performing as a sideman, solo performer, and band leader in concert and nightclub venues, primarily in the greater New York area. His debut album, Northern Tropical and Other Romantic Illusions, was released in September 2017, if I could get that out right. So it was released in September 2017. The instrumental single, I Wonder, was released in September 2018, and the single, Such a Groove, was released in April 2023. In 1981, he began attending events in the local Native American community. In 1992, he joined the Queens, New York-based Northeastern Native American Association, which is an intertribal cultural support organization. He served as group historian and chaired several powwow committees. During this time, he joined a Native American drum group, the Drum Circle Singers, and remained a member of this group from March 1992 through October 2003. He would also sing with the Iron Feather Singers and is a current member of the Red Thunder Bear Singers. Also, during the early 90s, at the urging of a Lenape elder, Jack Rainmaker, he began dancing at powwows in the area and has danced throughout the Northeast, US, and California. He also met NENAA member Bethana Ferguson in 1992, an Afro-Cherokee sister who had established the Torn Pages Project. This coalition would research and conduct cultural presentations examining African Native American interactions. He's the author of the book, Both Sides of the Water, Essays on African Native American Interactions, which was published in March of 2007 by Rose Dog Books. So as I said, what an amazing, amazing life you've led so far. And I'm definitely looking forward to hearing your presentation. So it's all yours, Lonnie.
Quote, both continents, Africa and America, be it remembered, were discovered. What a wealth of arrogance that little word contains, with devastating results for the indigenous populations, whose only human use thereafter was a source of capital for white people. On both continents, the white and dark gods met in combat, and it is on the outcome of this combat that the future of both continents depends. That's a quote from James Baldwin's No Name in the Street, published in 1972. Pomalakate, family. From my mother's side, I say, and Wendy, correct me if I get this wrong, Hauhana, Chiantamo, Ishtongo. But I got to give props and respect to my father's side of the family as well. So I will also say, Osio, Halito, Bezon. What I want to do is I'm going to do a lot of a personal narrative, and I'm going to intersperse it with and make historical references along the way. And I'm looking forward to, and I hope this time that we can all exchange later, because especially as I got to be an older man, I realize the diversity that we represent, and I find it beautiful. Yeah, we got issues, no doubt, but we need to respect that diversity and explore it in all of its forms. So I definitely would like to explore that with everyone that's here. But with that as a preface, I'm going to have a prologue. Ikanayuxka, that's a word from the Uiache, the ancient ones. One of three names for this landmass, Ikanayuxka, the land blessed by the sun, the moon, and the children, the stars. Others of the Uiache would call it Yaknefushke, pointed land. Others of those elders, those ancestors, would call it Ichibi, which means deer nose. And I don't know how without an airplane centuries ago, or even millennia ago, those ancestors realized the landmass looked like a deer nose. But yeah, I'm going to go there. A slaver by the name of Ponce de Leon gets there. It's been called Florida ever since. But I am originally from Florida, as Wendy read from my bio. And I want to start with Dania, which I understand now is called Dania Beach. I haven't been back in a while, but it's now officially called Dania Beach, which is between Fort Lauderdale and Hollywood. And we're going to the 1940s. A girl is forbidden by her mother to visit the Seminole camp along US 1. And this is a camp that those relatives would come out with certain times of the year. And they would like sell palmetto dolls, alligator wrestle for tourists. And that girl, who happens to be my mother, by the way, was also forbidden by her mother, my grandmother, from going to the Dania Seminole Reservation. For reasons I still can't fathom, even as an adult, but even before my grandmother joined the ancestors in '87, why she had this attitude, I don't know. Be that as it may, my mother disobeyed my grandmother and would go visit the camps. She would go visit the reservation. Now, her stepfather, Jake Robinson, and I will say quite up front, a man I will always lovingly acknowledge as my grandfather. Fantastic man. Knew about my mother's excursions and basically said, if your mama catches you, I don't know nothing. I was to find out a few years ago as an adult, Papa himself was Black Seminole. I didn't know that when I was a kid. And it's just by chance, one thing led to another, because we find out everybody's our cousins. And half of you are my cousins on this forum tonight anyway. Well, I found out that in fact, Papa was Black Seminole himself. But Ma would make those visits. Now, as Wendy read off, oh, I jumped ahead of myself. So Ma, okay, that was the 1940s, the 1950s. Ma became a student at Florida A&M. There she met a young man, a professional soldier who went on to have a career in the United States Army for 22 years. A wounded veteran of the Korean War had been reassigned to teach ROTC at FAMU while he was recuperating. His name was Lonnie Edward Harrington Jr., my father. Here I am, making a long story short. So around 1957, my mother, my sister, and I moved into my maternal grandmother in Dania. And it was there my mother would take me on visits to the Dania Reservation. And let me tell you, I've seen pictures now, and I've got another cousin that goes back and forth. What the res looked like then was nothing like it is now. And just on an aside, and Wendy's kind of used to my tangents, people think of me like up here when I talk about my boyhood as that guy from the swamps of Florida. You know, back in the 50s, you know, a lot of places that are suburbs now definitely did not look like it is now. And it was still pretty rural. But as it turns out, too, one of the biggest powwows in the country right now is still known as the Seminole Tribal Fair. I happen to be the distinction of being at that in 1957. But again, as a child of 4 or 5 years old, you don't realize what's going on. But nonetheless, my mother was making these connections. Now, Ma came north around 1958, living with Grandmama. But I want to also interject something interesting here, since most of us share both Black and Red ancestry. When I was enrolled in kindergarten in Dania, I went to the Crispus Attucks School. Now, at the time, Crispus Attucks was K through 12. And yes, from history, we know that Crispus Attucks was one of the first to die in the American Revolution War of Independence. But what I didn't know back then, and I may be preaching to some of the converted now, in a bigger sense, Crispus Attucks was one of us. His father was Black, but his mother was Wampanoag. Excuse me. Now, let me clarify something too, because some history books will say that his mother was Natick. To clarify that, and with all due respect to anyone's spiritual beliefs, unfortunately, some of our relatives were forced into Christianity, into praying towns. Crispus Attucks' mother was one of them. She's Wampanoag, and they're primarily from the Cape Cod area in southeastern Massachusetts. She was forced into a praying town at Natick, where she met Crispus's father, and Crispus came along. So there was that connection, although I didn't know it at the time. If I would know a little bit of Wampanoag, I know, I would say Gawakamish Addicts. His last name in the Wampanoag language means small deer or little deer. Gawakamish Addicts, greetings, little deer. So I mentioned that my mother had come north around 1958. She sent for me initially in 1959, and I spent several of my summers in Dania, and the full year from about 1963 to through June of 64, when I came back to New York, my sister and I. My mother didn't tell me of her experiences, though, when she would visit the camps and the reservation. And unfortunately, especially back then, and I think it's changed somewhat now, but there was a social stigma coming out of the South. If you were coming out of the South, coming to a city, you were considered country, period. And that was not cool. And everything that represented. And unfortunately, although I think the attitudes have changed somewhat now, I think in a reverse approach to the one drop rule, if you talked about having any Indian blood in some black circles, that wasn't cool at all. I didn't realize how vicious that could be until I got into high school. But I think that's another reason why my mother didn't mention a lot of her trips to the reservations and especially the camps along US 1 until I was an adult and I was involved in activities in the local indigenous community here. When Mom came to tell me that, in fact, she would have these Seminole women sit down and tell her stories. You know, I'm a storyteller also. Just to hear this coming out of my mother is just incredible. But I do want to backtrack just a little bit about my grandmother and her attitude. My grandmother would rarely talk about our indigenous heritage. Even though the few times she did, she acknowledged and remembers her grandmother, a full blood, with the English name of Hannah, that married a former slave by the name of George Washington. Whenever I do crazy stuff as a boy, and it's a miracle I'm alive now, call it divine intervention or dumb luck, but I would run off to the edge of the Everglades, and I should have been in the mouth of an alligator or crocodile, I don't know how many times, escaped snake bites a number of times, but I was scorpion bit. Anyway, my grandmother would blame me running off in the woods of my Indian blood before she beat my butt. I would say most of the time I had it coming, but be that as it may. She would also, when she'd get mad, she'd say, it's my Indian blood. But when I would try to ask her about details, she would shut up. Now, that's one of my Seminole lines, but there's also a Spanish Seminole line. And I'm not quite sure how Ancestor Maria fit in there, but my mother met her as a little girl. And our Spanish Seminole relatives have a very distinct history in their own right. But nonetheless, that's what my family line in terms of my Seminole heritage is on my mother's side. But my grandmother, even up till the time she left us in 1987, still rarely want to talk about that. Now, Grandmama was the youngest of 13. But I remember she did mock two of her brothers, and I forgot my granduncles' names, but she mocked them because those elders had tried to live traditionally. And my grandmother just always said that they were confused. And when I tried to get details, first as a little boy and then as an adult, my grandmother would just clam up again. Again, it'll always be that mystery, something she took to her grave while my grandmother did not want to acknowledge that. But anyway, as I was saying before, I didn't realize how vicious that attitude can be until I got to high school. Now, I went to high school in the Bronx, William Howard Taft High School. Now, my 10th and 11th grade social studies teacher, a guy by the name of Steve Obachinsky, still remember the dude. Had them both in 10th and 12th graders for social studies. For some reason, in a 10th grade class one day, we were talking about Indians. And I mentioned I had Indian blood. And of course, I drew Snickers from the class. So Mr. Obachinsky basically said, well, what kind of Indian are you? Being a young man coming up, I thought about my father's side of the family first. My grandmother, his mother was Cherokee and Choctaw. But I got out Choctaw first. And by the time, before I could say Cherokee, Obachinsky blurted out, hey, we got a chocolate Cretan in our midst. Let me be quite clear. I did have friends throughout high school, but that's what I became known as for the rest of my high school years. And I would be mocked mercilessly quite often. I was the chocolate Cretan. Now, our relatives in the Spanish Caribbean have a saying, La Sangre Llama, the blood calls. My mother raised me to be proud of everything that I am. I maintain that pride in terms of my indigenous heritage. I didn't know why, but I went kind of underground with it the rest of my high school years. And when it wasn't before I became an adult and started to do research, I realized why I had that. But something different happened to me when I got to college. I got to Hunter College in 1970. And again, for the sake of brevity, I made friends with a brother. Now, he looks quote unquote full blood. I don't know if he was or not, but Billy Joe Cruz was a full blooded, well, he was Cheyenne. And I remember in a conversation with him, I sort of shyly mentioned I had Indian blood. And all of a sudden, I found myself in a tight brotherly hug. Now, to say I was pleasantly surprised is an understatement because I'd been mocked anytime I brought up my heritage at that point. But Billy accepted me as a brother. And then I would believe it was Billy who said something that really started my attention going. He says, "You look like some of them Shinnecox." Now, the Shinnecox are people that live out here on what's called Long Island, but what they call, Siwanahaki or Pamanok, depending on what part of the island you're on. And in fact, a lot of Shinnecox look like some people that are here. Not everyone, all of them, but a lot do. But he intrigued me like that. And Billy said, we ought to go to the powwow. Apparently, he had gone to the Shinnecock powwow. Well, again, long story short, I didn't go to the Shinnecock powwows with Billy at the time. It wouldn't be until 1981 I would start heading out to Shinnecock. But he sort of piqued my curiosity. Now, I am a bookworm. I'm not going to show you my place, but my daughter says my place is in terminal bachelor mode. And she's right. If you saw my place, you'd probably want to call the EPA because I'm looking at my workout gear, my musical gear, books, DVDs, and CDs, and my turtle in the background making noise all over the place. But I've always been a heavy reader. For some reason, I started reading Book of the Hopi my last year at Hunter College, but this started opening the doors to other things. Now, I'm a musician. I'm a guitarist, percussionist, a singer-songwriter. In February of '73, I went to Boston to start playing with some soul R&B bands, and I also played with one rock band while I was up there. And I would play, gig out of Boston. We played the northeastern states in Eastern Canada pretty much through, like I said, from '73 through '76. Something interesting happened at a gig I did with one band in February of '76. We were playing in Calais, Maine, which is right on the border of Nova Scotia. Now, we were there for 6 nights, and although I didn't see this go down, on the second night that we were there, between our first and second set, while the DJ was playing some music, the local deputy sheriff beat up a Passamaquoddy boy for dancing with a white girl. The Passamaquoddy was some of the local indigenous people, and some of the young folks would come in, try to socialize. They weren't always welcome. Well, to say the least, tensions got very high after that in the town, but it gave me the opportunity to meet many of the Passamaquoddy people. And typical of their traditions, what I didn't know at the time, but I found out maybe 10 years ago, they had ongoing relationships with folks at Shinnecock. So even though I didn't mention my heritage to them, they were always very cordial to me the time that we were up there, and vice versa. But it was just sad to make their acquaintance under such circumstances. Now, the one rock band I played with while I was out of Boston, the Echo Bridge, we had a bass player from Brazil. And Eliazo, he and I had several discussions, and he brought up several things. He was also a capoeirista, and this, oh goodness, would end up playing a very strong part of my life later on as I ended up performing and being an administrator for a Brazilian dance company and band here in the city for a number of years. But he also mentioned maroon societies. Now, again, I hadn't made the connection yet with our own heritage. But when I heard of these free Black societies in Brazil, that again started to pique my interest. So when I came back to the city by 1977, my research was starting to be a bit more focused. I actually picked up a copy. I don't know if it's available anymore, but of this book, Maroon Societies, Rebel Slave Communities in the Americas, is a collection of essays. Now, with all due respect to our Haitian friends, and I get in trouble for saying this, but I just backed up academically, and I wonder why academics don't make the correction. Our Haitian relations weren't the first Black republic in this hemisphere. They're the longest surviving. If anything, that distinction goes to Palmares. Now, let me explain. Palmares was located in the northeastern part of Brazil, and it was identified even by the Dutch and later the Portuguese as the Republic of Palmares. It existed from roughly 1605 to 1695, and as I said, in Pernambuco region. Now, depending on what historian you speak with, they had either from 6 to 11 towns, and at one point believed to be more than 30,000 members. And something I found interesting, and I find this time and time again, be it the Quilombos of Brazil, the Palenques of the Spanish colonies, and parts of Central and South America and the Caribbean, many of them often mentioned, if not being mixed societies, Black and red, certainly having ongoing relationship with indigenous populations around them. Indeed, other readings I read about Palmares, there were indigenous people involved in that society. There was another Quilombo in Brazil, south of Bahia, known as Jaguaribe. Okay, again, it was a Black and red society. Now, I'm going to come a little bit north. I just talked about Palmares existing from roughly 1605, and it finally fell after mutual military expeditions in 1695. Oh, I'm going to go off on one of my tangents here, and I'll be brief, but Everybody knows the dance craze Zumba. Okay, well, whenever I hear that, the geek in me comes out because Zumba was actually one of the first leaders of Palmares. Okay, early on during his existence. His grandson, years later, would be the last ruler, Zumbi. And as I understand, the Black liberation movements and Black civil rights movement in Brazil are often named after Zumbi. But I digressed a little bit. Coming back to my point now, I'm going to come a little bit further north now, coming to the Spanish colonies. Now, when we start talking about the palenques in the Spanish colonies, be it Central or South America or the Caribbean, again, we see this phenomenon of unity. And I'm going to talk about divide and conquer in a moment. But right now, I'm looking at unity. And right now, I'm going to focus on areas that from the time period of 1580 to roughly 1630, we're talking about regions such as Guadalajara, Guanajuato, Veracruz. Alliances between escaped Africans and indigenous warriors practically brought Spanish commerce to a halt. It got so intense that Spain could only have trade trains going with heavy military escorts. Now, one of the leaders that led these raids against Spain was Yanga. But Yanga got so powerful, Spain finally got tired of trying to fight him and sued him for peace and allowed his settlement to flourish. And we're talking about the settlement outside of Veracruz called San Lorenzo de los Negros. Now, we find a similar phenomenon in Haiti, Quisqueya, where Haiti and the Dominican Republic are currently happening. The Taino freedom fighter, Guaracuyo, known to the Spanish as Enriquillo, similar thing. Spain tried to take him out, going up in the mountains after that, and they kept getting their butts kicked. So finally, they had enough. They sued Guaracuyo for peace. And as I understand it in the negotiations, Guaracuyo said, and this is a direct quote, because I'm trying to remember from different sources I've read over the years, many years ago. He identified that the Lukumi, those Africans among him practicing those spiritual traditions, are also our people. So he was looking out for the Black members of his society. And indeed, the stronghold for that culture, the Taino culture on the island, is near the Sabal Mountains. Now, I don't want to go off on too much another tangent. We want to talk, though, about some of our early relatives being terminated. Our Taino relatives were the first victims of termination in this hemisphere, but that's a topic for some other time. Because my Taino relatives, and I have many, are constantly reminded that they don't exist. But I said that's a topic for another discussion. My research became much more focused because I became aware of a facility here in New York City known as the Huntington Free Library in the Bronx. The collection no longer is there. It's been partial off all around the country, which is a great loss. I would make numerous trips over there from 1980 to maybe about 1984, 85 or so. And it was on my first trip, I realized now why La Sangre Llama, the blood calls, it's something you know in your heart, but can't quite put your finger on. Well, I think next to becoming a father, it was one of the most moving things that ever happened in my life so far. When I got to the library, I decided to myself, okay, I'm going to look at my Seminole heritage. So I pulled out several books, but the three I'm going to focus on right now are publications, two of which are books. One was The Exiles of Florida. The other was Notices of East Florida by the naturalist William Simmons. And then I also found a copy of the 1894 Department of Interior Census of the 5 civilized tribes, and I hate that term, of Indian Territory. I'm trying not to get emotional because one of these days I'm going to write a song called Silent Tears of Pride. I read about our ancestors. I read about their struggles, their triumphs. I read about the Negro Fort. I read about how those ancestors defended our other relatives at the Battle of Bowlegstown. I read about Paliklakaha. And by the way, he's no longer with us, but Brother John Griffith, who's now with the ancestors, finally helped me pronounce that correctly, because I always was screwing up the pronunciation. But I knew now why I had that pride in my heart. I do want to point something out about that census, though, because something really caught my attention, and I actually put it in my book, a quote. Now, I know some of you here are aware of our Yamasee relatives we have in South Carolina. And in fact, the Yamasee history, and we're all intertwined, goes much, much further back. But when the Department of the Interior looked at the Yamasee among the Creeks in Indian Territory, and I'm quoting now from a U.S. government document, believed to be descendant of shipwrecked African sailors and Indian women. Now, some of our other relatives sometimes get a little bit uptight when we say they got black blood. And I had a Lumbee brother, and he was my brother because we were a cut up. My ex-wife couldn't stand him because we were always getting in trouble. Okay, a little bit too much info, but I'll behave, Wendy, because you started looking at me in a tone of voice. I see that. I happen to mention when he said that, in his heritage, he had Yemisi ancestry, and I mentioned he had African blood. He copped an attitude. But about a week later, he came back kind of shyly. He says, my grandfather says you're right. And I go, what do you mean? When he said that he told his grandfather what I said, his grandfather told him that in their oral traditions, it mentioned that some of the ancestors were dark-skinned men with woolly hair that came from the sea. The oral traditions along some of the people of the East Coast. And Wendy and I, we had that exchange the other day, and we agree, never throw out oral traditions. I think it's just as valid as what's written. And where did those folks that write that thing down get some of it to begin with? Now, I will also thank different families that have shared their oral traditions with me over the years. Heritages out of the Caribbean, where they tell me that, there were stories in their heritage, like Maroons out of Jamaica saying they welcome surviving Arawaks in their societies, and stories from others. Some of our Taino relatives talked about how to shield some of their African relatives when Spain came after them on the different islands, be it Borinquen or Quisqueya. They said, are there any slaves here? They go, no, because when Africans often got to these villages, they were liberated. So the Tainos would say, no slaves here, and hide out their African relatives. Yeah, there's a lot to learn from oral traditions. I want to jump around a little bit, but it's also history. Before I get into divide and conquer, I want to look at a phenomenon which annoys me to no end, although it's changing somewhat now. And any academics here can certainly correct me, but outside of certain academic and certain specific cultural circles, okay, true. We look at the war between the states, the Civil War. In fact, yes, some units, some indigenous nations did sign treaties and fight for the Confederacy. Now, on an aside, and yeah, I'm showing my bias here. You just signed treaties with the folks that got us run out of the homelands. What is wrong with you? But be that as it may. Okay, Albert Pike, who represented the Confederate States of America, made his rounds in Indian Territory and recruited everyone from some Creeks, okay, to some Cherokees, some Chickasaws, some Choctaws, et cetera, et cetera. But what is rarely spoken about are the units that fought for the Union. Okay, like the Indian Home Guards. Okay, now that's just the theater that was in Indian Territory. If you look at other parts of the Civil War and other parts of the United States, what's the United States or the Confederate States, you had other indigenous units fighting for the Union. Units like such in the Army, the 1st Michigan Sharpshooters, Company K, comprised primarily of Ottawa people. Okay, also in the U.S. Army, the 14th New York Artillery, Company D, comprised of Senecas. Now, interestingly enough, because, one drop rule, and yeah, racism is still a reality. Those of our brothers who are both mixed black and red, if you didn't look red enough, you got thrown into the U.S. colored troops. And I told the doctor that I've been mentioning colored troops so much, and yes, certainly back then, those were the black soldiers primarily were known as the United States colored troops. But another interesting phenomenon happened in Indian Territory. Many of the interpreters look like us. Okay, there are many reasons why those brothers, primarily brothers, spoke the indigenous languages as well as English. So whereas white officers may not necessarily want to be in command of troops of color, they realized that the black guy got killed, they would have no way of communicating with their troops. And don't take my word for this. This has been documented by many other academics as well as oral tradition. And just on an aside, some of our relatives that are in on this call right now, what I call the most integrated battle of the Civil War, like a weird twist on affirmative action, was the Battle of Honey Springs in July of 1863 in Indian Territory. We had red, black, and white units fighting for the Union, and red and white units fighting for the Confederacy. And it was the Union that won that day. You can't make this stuff up. Now, sort of you going in a segue toward divide and conquer. I know, unfortunately, sometimes there are negative attitudes when the Buffalo Soldiers are mixed up, or even the Scouts. And let me just say also, on both sides of the family, certainly if you're Washington, and there were Washingtons among the Scouts, they're some of my ancestors. I will also say this, and yes, I'm going to go off and go there. On my father's side of the family, the man who would marry a Shawnee woman by the name of Alice and give birth to Lonnie I, my grandfather, Okay, he was a veteran of the 10th Cavalry, veteran of San Juan Hill. It was the Buffalo Soldiers that took that hill, not Teddy Roosevelt. But honest, I promise, it's decaf. It's decaf, honest, Wendy. But I digress somewhat. Now, the Buffalo Soldiers have a history that goes way, way beyond the Indian Wars, certainly going up to World War II. But yeah, we can talk about whatever they did on the behalf of the U.S. government against indigenous populations. But we'd have to finger point because that went around. You had, quote unquote, full-blooded indigenous people also scouting for the army, doing all kinds of things, sometimes against their own people. The Apache scouts are like that also. But again, I'm not trying to assign blame. But history is not always black and white. I want to bring up a gray area and name a specific incident that happened in 1887. Now, this happened between the territories of Utah and Colorado. And this would involve a group of Ute people. Now, this particular band of Ute people were under the leadership of a man known as Colorado, who was actually a Comanche, but was raised from a boy among Utes to a position of leadership. And I don't remember the specific date in 1887, but nonetheless, with a large group of his people, elders and young people and families, he led a large group of them away from the reservation in Utah, trying to go back to some of their traditional lands in Colorado. Bad idea. When they got to Colorado, they came under attack constantly from different white people, sheriff's deputies, and then the Colorado militia was mobilized to come after them. Now, the Colorado militia were the ones that in November 1864 had the Sand Creek Massacre. They were commanded by a man who was not only was a colonel with the militia, but also a minister. And I'm not trying to be critical of anyone's spiritual beliefs, but John Shimington also was a Christian minister, but he led that massacre against a group of Cheyenne and Arapaho people who were allied with the United States. November of 1864. These were the guys now coming after Colorado's people, but he couldn't travel quick enough because he had elders with him and families with youngins as well. Now, a Lieutenant George Burnett from Fort Duchesne in Utah got word of what was going on, and with a large group of soldiers from the 9th Cavalry, rode out as quick as they could and intercepted Colorado and protected that group of Utes from the Colorado militia. Now, the militia didn't necessarily respect black troops, but they realized that they attacked any regular U.S. Army unit, they'd have more trouble than they can bargain for, so they backed off. And what happened as a result of that, a high level of respect happened between that community and that particular group of Buffalo Soldiers. Now, again, I'm not trying to excuse anything, but again, we have to look in detail and try to be objectively as possible because we have these gray areas. Now, we can go on and on about divide and conquer, and certainly, and I think I may have had some discussions in prior forums, either here or other formats, about my opinion about what continues to happen in Oklahoma. And certainly some of our relatives on this forum tonight in Oklahoma can talk about the nonsense, I'm trying to keep my language civil, that they often have to deal with even today. But it goes back to those divide and conquer tactics that go back centuries, and certainly in terms of our heritage as Southeastern peoples before the Trail of Tears. But for the sake of brevity, I'm going to mention one incident that happened way, way back in before the establishment of the United States, but we're going back now to colonial times, and we're going to look at colonial New Orleans in 1729. Now, what was interesting here, strange twist of fate, around that time, there was a governor named Perrier. Now, I don't know if he was the ancestor of those soft, bubbly guys, but I digress again. But nonetheless, the governor general had a problem because Africans were escaping and allying and being taken into societies, ironically enough, of Choctaw and Chickasaw, which centuries later, but those relationships are always that good, to say the least. And again, some other relatives here on the forum tonight can maybe enlighten us further about more contemporary things. But be that as it may. So Africans were accepted in Choctaw society at the time. We're talking about the late 1720s. They were being accepted among the Chickasaw, militarily powerful. They were also being accepted by one of the mightiest nations in the area at the time, the Natchez. And Perrier did not have enough troops to challenge any of them, and especially the Natchez. So what did he do? He gave semi-free status, and I know what that means. But he gave semi-free status to enslaved Africans, gave them weapons, and had them attack a small community of the Chauwasha people who weren't that numerous. Those surviving Chauwashas would start spreading the words that you couldn't necessarily trust Black people. And we see variations on this happening between our relatives, Black and Red, going on for centuries. So for every instance of unity, we have instances of divide and conquer as well. I could go on and on and on, but I'm going to sort of cut it off right here. Although I'm going to mention one other thing, but I want us to have a chance to share among each other. And certainly I'm willing to take critiques or again, it's just exchange because again, and I got kind of emotional with Wendy the other day. I'm so happy you and the other sisters have organized these forums. And again, as an old man, to know that our people are talking to each other and our allies. I have no words to say how this warms my heart. And like I said, most of you are my cousins anyway. But before I do that, I'm going to give this food for thought. Now, I mentioned our relatives here on what they call Siwanahaki, the island of shells or shell heaven. Yeah, I mentioned the Shinnecock before. As a matter of fact, there are two reservations out here on the island. Now, Queens is politically part of New York City, but we're geographically part of Long Island. But there are two counties that are also in Long Island, Nassau and Suffolk County. In Suffolk County, we have two reservations. The federally recognized reservation of our Shinnecock relatives in Southampton, and the state recognized reservation of the Unkachog, Puspatock, and Mastic Shirley. And I've got friends out there too. But those aren't the only indigenous people that survived. And not all of them, but yeah, there's been a lot of heavily African intermarriage over the years. In fact, the Montauk proper, who again, Governor Hochul, and that's a whole other topic we have some other time, stopped the Montauks from getting back their recognition. Basically, I don't have the full court transcript in front of me, but when they lost their recognition in 1908, it was at a court, I believe in East Hampton, and some railroad interests, which would eventually set the groundwork for the Long Island Railroad, were trying to take over some lands that the Montauk were trying to hold on to proper. But the judge looked around and saw these quote unquote Indians and said, I don't see any Indians here, and gave away the last of their land to the railroad interests. But my point is, there are still other people, and they would call them Montaukets generally. Okay, supposedly 13 major nations of the island, but I still have friends among the Montauk proper. They say Talkit, and again, I've been blessed to be both sing and MC some of the Setauket cultural ceremonies for years. They may be Algonquin, but they're my home folks up here. And they've been putting up with my goofiness for years, so you got to give them some props for that. But they're primarily the Seltalkots in the Setauket area, as well as our Matinecock relatives. Okay, everywhere from roughly, if you know the New York City area, figure from LaGuardia Airport out to Glen Cove, with Flushing being their stronghold, all Matinecock areas. And there's still many Matinecock still around, and many Matinecock friends, and even Canarsie. There's a photo from an exhibit I was in back in the late 90s called African Native Americans. We're still here. There's a picture of me with my Canarsie sister, Pat Darnley, also known among the community as Paw Paw. But my point is, and I'll leave you with this, the indigenous people of Long Island were taking in Africans in the 1800s. The Amistad, everybody knows that story, or a lot of it do know that story, seized off of Long Island roughly August of 1839, if I'm not mistaken. If that boat would have made landfall, the boat would have been found, but probably not the people, because again, I'm just speculating on my part, but the indigenous people of Siwanahaki, Pamanaki were taking in Africans. And I'll leave you by just saying things that make you go, With that being said, I will say in the language as best I can, what little I do speak of Miccosukee and Creek, which I happen to ruin all the time. But I will say, Shanabis Tapoji, I thank you for listening now. And if we can we open the floor? If I haven't put anyone to sleep.
Yeah, so if anyone has any questions, please feel free to ask. I saw you raise your hand, Dr. Al.
You mentioned the Shinnecock. When I was a child, we visited the reservation. My grandparents had a house in Selden, which is sort of middle of the island. And
my mother's in Coram, by the way, Doctor.
Yeah. And it was interesting. It was because small reservation. One of the things that's interesting is the Shinnecock had a New York State reservation.
Recognition.
Yeah, recognition for close to 200 years. And I think they were the last Indian nation to get federal recognition. I don't think any has received it since, and it's like 30 or 40 years. And one of the main people speaking against it is running for president now. Because he was afraid they were going to open up a casino.
Man, you had to go there. Let me tell you something, okay?
And he said that exact phrase. They don't look like Indians to me.
Well, he tried that with the Mashantucket, our relatives up at Foxwood, and he got run out of Connecticut. Governor Lowell Weicker basically called him a racist and said, "You got no place in Connecticut." But to bring it closer to home, now I'm not enrolled, but I've been, goodness, for at least 35 years. I get the tribal newspaper out of Florida. Trump tried that nonsense down in Florida. Now, I think it was around 94, 95. It made the front page of the Seminole Tribune. James Billy was tribal chairman at the time. And he had one of the relatives from Mashantucket there, who he adopted as a brother. He had his arm around it and he goes, "He looks like an Indian to me. What do you think?" And Trump just hung his head. So he's been trying this nonsense all up and down the East Coast. I know he messed with our friends with Ramapo, and I've got a cousin who's Ramapo, Puspatuk. Well, she's married to Unkachog, but her father's Miccosukee, so we're distant cousins, I found out too. So yeah, he's been doing this nonsense for ages. Yeah, what Michael Jordan Indians, I think he says. Oh man, don't get me started on this guy because my language will not be so civil. But I'll behave. Honest Wendy, I'll behave. I'll behave.
Well, I do have a question that's probably a weird segue away, but in your bio, you mentioned your books, and I wanted to ask, is there anywhere that we can purchase them, or where can we find them?
Okay, I just found out by accident. It seems to be out of print now by the publisher. I'm trying to still get to the bottom of that. With that being said, I still have a few copies of the original edition. Oh, what I read you before, the quote from James Baldwin is in the original edition. In 2021, for legal reasons, I had to take it out. So if you find the latter version, it won't have that James Baldwin quote on page 5. I still have a few copies. And I just mentioned my cousin, Marcy, who's Ramapo and Miccosukee and married to an Unkachog. They have stands at the powwows. So yeah, on the powwow trail, she still has a few copies. But I have copies and anyone interested, can contact me. You can go to my website, which has primarily music, but you can get my LonnieHarrington.com, but has my email address on there. And if you're interested, I can see to it that you can get one of the few copies that are still left. Oh, and this is my beat up copy, but that's the book. And as I mentioned, I'm trying to get to the bottom. Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Can you give me, in addition to that book, can you give me 3 or 4 other recommendations, books that you have read? What are you reading? What would you recommend? Since you're a beloved reader like myself. Yeah.
My research is ongoing, although it's not particularly focused right now. Let me just say this also. Somebody I have a deep respect for, and we've been sharing notes for at least 35 years, Dr. Adalberto Dixon, who's also one of us. He's primarily Saponi, but he has Creek and Seminole, one part of his family also. Ari is elderly now, along with his wife, who's Montauk, by the way. They don't travel as much, but Ari, oh my goodness. We're always trading notes. He recently sent me an essay, which I'm reaching for right now, entitled Shrewd and Sagacious Middlemen, Black Go-Betweens in the Florida Borderlands, 1817 to 1836. Now, apparently, this is an essay that appeared in Ethnohistory, the April 2024 edition. And that's published by the American Society of Ethnohistory. And it's about some of our relatives in Florida that were go-betweens between, indigenous people and white people back during those tumultuous times, primarily before the Second War, going into the Second War, and shortly thereafter. I found that quite interesting. And Anne, you'll find this interesting because you've heard me go off on some of the other forums you and cousin Denise organize. This professor said this too. There was no Seminole Nation in 1823. There was a loose alliance of villages, but there was no Seminole Nation of 1823. So when them folks in Oklahoma start acting stupid, and yet it's probably why I get kicked out of places, tell them that. Even academics are saying that now. There was a loose alliance, but there was no organized Seminole Nation of Oklahoma. So when they try to come down on you cousins out there, and let me try to calm down now. They got no ground to stand on. It's about as shaky as the San Andreas fault. But let me calm down now.
Okay.
Going back to your question now. I'll calm down, cuz. If you can find it, and again, some of these are quite old. Maroon societies, and it's overall, they do talk somewhat about North America too, but it's primarily the Caribbean, Central and South America, and somewhat the United States. If we're looking at quote unquote Latin America, I'd also recommend this collection of essays called Beyond Black and Red, African Native Relations in Colonial Latin America, but it also includes some essays on what was happening in Florida, okay, during that time. Also, Ari, early this year, told me about a book which I got, which I found really, really enlightening, primarily about Florida, but it's called, oh, I'm so happy to have all these geeks on here, man. Usually people tell me to shut up when I do this stuff. But be that as it may, The Great Florida Seminole Trail. It's a complete guide to the Seminole Indian historic and cultural sites by Doug Aldersons.
Okay.
Great. They go into detail about some sites in Florida. So I guess that to start with. But actually, if you can get a hold of my book, the bibliography, in my bibliography is about, oh my goodness, about 5 to 6 pages long. Only one book in my bibliography I didn't read cover to cover. So every other book in there over years I read. Let me also say this. I don't know if any younger researchers on here tonight, but some of you have heard me mention one younger brother, who actually some of our is a cousin too, as it turns out, Gabriel Adam. He's one of those younger generations of researchers now who is a true guardian of our history. And again, as an old man now, to see these young men and young women passionate about our history and that well, I'm getting kind of emotional again for an old man, but to see them guarding our history, man, I know the torch has been passed, and I'm so proud of these youngins. I'm so proud of these young. Oh, I'm going to go off again, and I've contacted you some about this now. So I'm actually wearing a necklace right here, but earlier this year, at a forum here in New York City by the Urban Indigenous Collective, it was a forum entitled Afro-Indigenous Women in Traditional Healing. I'd met a young sister I'd known about, but I had the opportunity to meet Dr. Thomasina Chupko, originally from the Fort Pierce Reservation. Deep respect for the sister. Now, she's actually done a number of initiatives formerly for the Seminole Tribe of Florida, but she's been active both in Gullah Geechee circles on the East Coast, and she founded a company called Indigenous Intentions. As a matter of fact, I'm wearing a necklace that I got from her. It has the 4 sacred colors, which appears on both the Seminole Tribe of Florida flag and the Miccosukee Tribe of Florida flag. No, she didn't pay me to say this, but go to their website, Indigenous Intentions. All of the money goes to social causes, primarily murdered and missing Indigenous women. But again, Sister Thomasine has been active in all kinds of social justice issues. And again, I've told her this. I'm so proud of some of our young folks. You know, and especially what gets me to, like I mentioned some of my things coming up where I had to be on the defensive. A lot of these young folks proudly say, and they ain't taking no crap from nobody. They say, yeah, we are Afro-Indigenous, and they will get in your face about it. I know in Miccosukee the term is Shana. I give Shana respect and salutation to our young people. I'm so proud of them.
All right.
And again, okay, and I'm not pushing, she doesn't know I'm pushing our company, but let's support our own as much as possible. So check out their website. And yeah, she doesn't know I'm doing this, but I think I told Wendy this. I think she actually runs her company out of Atlanta. If you ever have a chance to meet her, certainly meet the sister. I have deep respect for her. So I think that'll keep your hands busy for a while. And if you can manage to get a copy of my book, and actually I think it's in the library in some library either in Tulsa or Oklahoma City, because there are a few libraries around the country that has it, but you know, both sides of the water. But yeah, you can check out the bibliography there. That'll keep you busy for a while, including one book which I can't pull out right now because it'll cause one of my bookshelves to collapse. But anything by J. Leach Wright. Well, he had wrote a book. I know some of this is old, but I think some of the information is still pertinent. Creeks and Seminoles. Highly recommend that. Oh, and I just lost my train of thought. I guess the
Getting old, Lonnie, like the rest of us.
Oh, cuz he had to go there. But hey, I know I'm a used car. Definitely. No ifs, ands, or buts. But that'll keep you busy for a while.
Okay.
You know, the one drop rule had one exception. Because Pocahontas was an ancestor of George Washington and Robert E. Lee and a whole bunch of other people. So if you had one drop of Pocahontas, you were white. And when, you know, now that it's so easy to trace DNA, you know, ancestry, it's astonishing the percentage of people who aren't white, according to the one drop rule. That because, you know, over centuries or so, they just lost track of who the ancestor was. It's likely, yeah, it's likely that anyone who arrived in the U.S., anyone of European background who arrived in the U.S., whose people arrived in the U.S. before 1700, has got some Indian or some African, and they don't even know it.
To be quite blunt about it, I do mention in my book that our sisters, be they Black or Indigenous or combination thereof, were often in a number of different sort of sexual situations. Some of them consensual, but unfortunately, let's face it, tragically, many of them weren't. And some of the mess we have today with our missing sisters now is still because of that mess. But I hear what you're saying, man. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Hello,
Hey,
everybody.
does Jerry? Oh, I'm sorry.
Yes. No, I was about to say Jerry was
Okay.
trying to say something.
Yeah,
I'll wait.
that's
Got to him.
yeah. We saw you waving,
It's
Jerry.
it's muted.
You're muted.
Hey, Jerry, you're muted. And hey, Gabriel, it's crazy you just joined because Lonnie just mentioned you.
And I'm not your agent, Gabriel. What's up, young blood?
Hello, good sir. God bless, cousin.
What's up, good sir, man? You gotta make sure you're talking to. I end up in a neck brace. It's your fault, man.
No. You are seasoned and more than able to handle anything. I'm glad you're having this conversation today.
Well, I was just pushing you, man. And I'll say this again. And I've told you this. I'm so proud of you, man.
Oh, thank you.
You're one of that generation. You are such a guardian in your integrity, your research you've done, man. I'm very proud of you, young blood. Very proud of you.
Thank you.
Well, let me say this while Jerry's trying to unmute.
Okay.
There you go.
I finally got it, but go on. Am I on?
You
Yeah.
are.
Yes, sir.
Okay. So I just wanted to say, Mr. Harrington, it's very informative. Really enjoyed your talk. And one thing that hit me that I've always wondered about the Black Seminoles and also the infantry Buffalo Soldiers, if there was any consideration when they were fighting the Indians, that if they ever give them a break because they knew their situations, and you kind of touched on that yeah, it did happen sometimes that, they gave the Indians a break. I always thought that might have happened every once in a while.
Now I'm going to quote a fiction, which was the subject of criticism in another forum a few months ago. But it's a great action movie called Buffalo Soldiers with Danny Glover.
Yeah.
And others in it. Carl Lundy. Great work of fiction. Didn't go down like that, but something did happen in that movie, what implies what you're saying toward the end. Now, let's be quite blunt. Okay, that thing that went down at Rattlesnake Springs, no, those Apache relatives fought their way out of Rattlesnake Springs. But there, the Buffalo Soldiers gave them a break and let them go to Mexico. So, yeah, and actually, Wendy and I were talking the other day about some of the things we hear in oral history. Yeah, these sort of situations went down where those brothers gave them that respect and would, basically turn their back on certain situations. Though I do know this now. Okay. Groups of the 25th Infantry, the 9th and 10th Cavalry get most of the play, but you also have the 24th and 25th Infantry were also Buffalo Soldiers. At one point in time, members of the 25th Infantry were assigned to guard Sitting Bull, or Tatanka Wantanka, as he's known among his people. And it says, as opposed to white soldiers, Sitting Bull had deep respect for these men because he said these men respected him. So, and again, I'm not trying to excuse, and I think we need to continue objective discussions that what may have been done on behalf of the United States during that turbulent time. But no, these other situations that you're implying to did happen. And brother, please call me Lonnie. Again, we're all relatives here, and I'm so happy again that we're having this forum. Please call me Lonnie. Because when you call me Mister, I think I might owe you money or something, man. I'm like, whoa, what's going on with that? I'm just saying now, man. I'm just saying. But good to meet you, sir.
Good to meet you.
All right. Hey, I just would like to say hello to everybody. And I see a lot of faces I've seen before and some I haven't seen before. I just want to say I had a wonderful time when I was in Brackett. And hopefully I can get back soon to visit you guys again. This, like Jerry said, is very informative. It was so much information, it almost overamped me, so, but I did hear a few things that I kind of knew about. I'm not a historian, but it has to start somewhere, you know what I'm saying? So I'm real thankful to join this and hear what I've heard. Mr. Harrington, you did an excellent job, and I'm thankful to be invited to this Zoom meeting. But I have a question. You mentioned about the interpreters. I'm the band chief for the Dozer Barkers Band of the Seminole Nation of Oklahoma. What do you know a lot of information or any information on the interpreters?
Give me a second, and let me try to find my bibliography, because where I got that information from, I used some other information from it, but there was actually a book published on the Civil War where I got that information from, by Lawrence Hauptman, who's an academic.
Specifically, I will be speaking about Cudjoe.
Oh, in terms of specifics like that I don't know, sir, to be quite honest.
Yeah.
But let me try to find out the name of that book for you.
Yeah, Cudjoe would be my third great grandfather. I believe Abraham was supposed to be a relative to him, also a brother or a nephew or something, but I'm not for sure,
Well, then I know some of your cousins, man.
That's right. Abraham interpreted for the tribe. Cudjoe interpreted for the Indian scouts. And it's not too much written or said about Cudjoe because he was trusted by the scouts and the government is who he interpreted for. And so it's not a lot written about him. Even when they was chasing down Osceola, he was the guy. But it's just a point of that. Some people, sometimes you have to do what you have to do to survive. And that's why we still here today, to sit here to talk with one another because of their actions. And I'm amazed by the setup, of Seminole freedmen, or they say some Black Seminoles, basically controlling the negotiations, because they was on both sides. They was the one, they knew every move that the other one was going to do. And so, yes, we were undefeated. We was not defeated in any form or fashion because of that fact. And I just like to read some more and learn some more about Cudjoe because it's not written. And plus, he's my grandfather.
Okay. Two things real quick. Now, I mentioned before an essay that's in the publication Ethnohistory. They don't talk about what went on in terms of Oklahoma, but in terms of guides back during the Florida Wars, yeah, a few of them were suspected of being double agents, so some of them didn't end up too well.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
But I know I might be preaching to the converted when I say, let's face it, after the Civil War, some of us were interpreting in Washington, both for Creeks and Seminoles.
Yeah.
So I know Cousin Ann was mentioning before that some of the people were saying that, we haven't lived up our part of the bargain. Man, we've been repping. We've been repping the whole time. So what are you talking about? Let me calm down. I'm drinking decaf. But go back to answer your question directly. I don't know if they'll have the specific information, but the book I was referring to is this: Between Two Fires: American Indians in the Civil War, by Lawrence Hauptman, and that's the Free Press paperbacks. And you spell Hauptman Hauptman, Lawrence Hauptman. Okay. And I don't know if young brother Gabriel might have some more information on this or not, because I know his research has gone a lot of places I haven't gone. So I don't know if you can add to this, Gabriel, or not.
Sure. Let me make certain I understand the question one more time. You were asking for information in regards to your grandfather specifically, right? Because I was just processing dialogue.
If you knew anything about it, yeah. Okay. Yes, sir.
Okay. Lonnie, go ahead and let me go ahead and go into my files and research. I don't have it right in front of me at the moment, but I will be most certain, and Lonnie know me, I'm always gonna keep my word about this. I will get back to you. I will get back with you as soon as I can with those particular receipts. My area of specialty, my area of expertise, more so is in regards to some of the dynamics of coalitions that happened right around the times of those Seminole Wars. But I know that as a general point of conversation, if this answers a little bit of it, there were at points, for the sake of survival and protection, name changes that did happen. And so because of that, where people have to change names, you know what happens when you're traveling through an area, you can't necessarily mention who you are.
Right.
Target on your back. And so you have to sometimes change your identity temporarily, but if you don't have people in those spaces knowing what the deal is, then they can forget why the name was changed, and then you can end up having a loss of information translation. Is that making sense what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Okay, but give me some time because I don't have my books readily available in front of me. I just got back from teaching today, some of my students, but I will get back with you as soon as within my earliest power. Lonnie, I'm going to send you some stuff as well. Is that doable? Is that something that I can do?
Yeah.
Good. Cool.
You can get
So
my email or email it
do
to
y'all
me.
want to, exchange emails?
Yeah.
Yes, I would love that. Let me do that in the chat.
PL Barkus 43 at Gmail. PL Philip Lee Barkus, Barkus.
BRKUS.
Barkus.
Okay.
That's it.
Stellar. I will definitely be getting in touch with you as soon as I can.
That's fine. Take your time.
Of course.
To lighten this up a little bit, Wendy, could I cut up just a little bit at the risk of seeming shameless and self-serving?
Of course, I'm not going to tell you no.
Not yet, anyway. Don't put your hand on your hip just yet. So, I don't know if any of you are familiar with my music, but I'll just say this. My song, Seminole Girl, is a true story. Sister had me tripping, but you can check that up your own right. I'm just saying that.
I have a question, actually, in the spirit of lightheartedness, but in the spirit of curiosity. And this is something that I can definitely say as a young blood. The reason why is because something I've noticed. For those who don't know, Lonnie and I have actually done presentations together on several occasions, and along with Sister Wendy as well. And one thing that Lonnie and I talked about at one point was how the information that is being discussed here tonight is so critical, and yet because of how, and I would just say it directly, because of some of the gatekeepers that are present in our world, this information has not been disseminated across the country effectively. And I'm a freedom fighter. I'm a frontline worker when it comes to getting these stories out on why certain things don't translate. So Lonnie, can I ask you a question real quick? My question would be, what are some of the practical ways that you've noticed young adults being able to disseminate the things that you and I have talked about and that I know you shared here tonight? What are some of the things that you would say are practical ways for young adults to disseminate this information, particularly young adults who are within the ages of 12 and up? I know there was a book resource you told me about one time, and I did give one or two away to my kids. And by the way, I'm in a predominantly white space for those who don't know. So I already know I'm already in enemy territory, but I had some kids going to my bookshelf, and I just ever so slightly put a book about the Black Seminoles and about the Seminole Wars. And I noticed that the kids, once they started to pick up, I think we were in class one time. Lon, you can testify to this. We were in class, and a kid asked Mr. Graves, "What are you, by the way?" And I said, "Well, I'm African American in part, but I'm also indigenous, particularly Black Seminole, and a couple other things." And he went online. I didn't think it was going to happen so fast. The kid went online, looked me up. He saw Lonnie's name, saw the work that he did in the Trump circles, and said, "Wait, oh my gosh, Mr. Graves, you're famous. Who is Lonnie Harrington?" I thought, who is this? You are a white kid in a very upper class part of Georgia, but okay. And I called Lonnie on the phone on the spot because the kid said, "There's no way you can know."
Interrupted man trying to cook his chicken. What is this world coming to?
It was 2 in the afternoon. The kid said, there's no such thing as Black symbols today." Oh, do tell.
Oh.
Called Lonnie on the phone. He said, "Hello, yeah, young blood. I got some students who want to talk to you." Oh my gosh! And this is in 8th grade, but they listened, and they were talking about Black Seminoles the entire year to the point we did a map project, and we literally had the kids draw out the maps of the journeys of the Black Seminoles, as well as any and all the Gullikins, and we had Black Seminoles in Red Bay, Bahamas as well, and others that went all the way out to Oklahoma and then Nacimientos as well. But Lonnie, I really have to know what would be your wisdom for getting what you've shared with so many to the next generation, so that when I become an old blood and we have moved on, this information is set in place. How would you say we should pass this on?
Well, I don't mean to cop out, even though I do, as an administrator, have a background in arts and education. There's no one size fits all. I think initiatives that you took with your students is one way. Certainly holding forums. I know when I was a member of the Torn Pages Project, we were called upon to do presentations for school groups where we looked at, cultural things that happened between people of African descent and indigenous descent in this hemisphere. I mentioned before, there's some other folks now, young people taking initiative in a much broader sense, presenting aspects of the culture. I mentioned here in New York City, there's the Urban Indigenous Collective. And in fact, there are young people of all different sorts of indigenous backgrounds. But again, there's that factions that's proudly Afro-Indigenous. I mentioned a forum of one of the sisters. As a matter of fact, I sent you some information about Dr. Chuko, if I remember correctly. Again, a lot of you young people aren't taking any. I was on the defensive as a kid. I didn't have anybody to back me up now. But over the past 10, 15 years, I meet more and more young folks. You try to come up with some nonsense, they are in your face. So I think actually what you're saying, there needs to be, and it probably will, maybe after my time, because I'm getting up there now, there may be some ways of one specific sort of format or several kinds of specific formats where this information can get out. But I think right now, we're in a time of imagination where we can disseminate this information in the best way we see fit. I know that's not a specific answer, but that's the best I can do right now. Because again, at this point, there's no one size fits all.
Yeah.
And please, anybody else here, correct me.
Yeah, I just want to say, I think, Gabriel, the fact that your students or your one student got it, it just kind of makes me so sad to think that there isn't a curriculum where it is imperative for young kids, even if they're not Black Seminole, to learn about this history. Because, at our museum in Brackett, we've only had one group of students come to the museum, and it sort of took an act of Congress for that to happen. But speaking directly to young kids, and first of all, the questions that some of them asked helped us to sort of redirect some of the ways that we even told the story within the museum, and how interested they were. It wasn't them on their phones playing games. If we make a space for them to learn about this history, even if they're not Black Seminole, even if it doesn't pertain to them, they will find an interest in some aspect of it. But we don't have a space for them to learn, So yeah, if we could just get it in the schools, if there was just, 1 week of learning about Florida history for every school in the US, that would be amazing,
Gabriel, let me make a suggestion. I don't know if this book is available anymore because I read it back in the 90s, but it was actually written for middle school kids, but it was about the Second Seminole War. It was called Hunted Like a Wolf. I don't remember the author's name, and it may be out of print at this point. But if you can track that down, again, it was written with middle schoolers in mind.
Yeah. A lot of
And Wendy, I'm sorry.
well, I was just going to say, it just you have to play on preconceived misconceptions, the mindset, the shock and awe. I grew up right here in Wewoka, and it was like a shock and awe when they said Indians had slaves, because I just thought about the South. The shock and awe, of Black Indians, when you first heard that they were Black cowboys, because we're programmed from a young age by watching TV of a certain stereotype. And so just the shock and awe sometimes will make, like you say, they'll get on their phone now and Google it and start looking up things themselves. And that is, if you're talking about a classroom thing, is different than just conversation or being able to say something, just one-on-one or one or two or three, but it's just like you say, it's a vast way, in different ways. That's where wisdom comes in, to know when, to know how, what time and what time not to, so
Right.
we just have to, first thing to do is we have to learn ourselves. And so we have to apply ourselves to understanding before we can try to teach someone else. And go ahead.
And y'all have me fired up now. The educator in me, especially in this current climate in America where people want to ban books and ban information, the educator in me leaps at the answers that you guys have given. Thank you, especially Lonnie, for that book recommendation you gave and that Wendy put in the chat. I'm going to jump on that. Something that I thought about, which is interesting, is how our experiences that are lived don't always translate into the minds of people that are supposed to be your partners. I remember seeing kids at my school and others that said, oh yeah, we love Native Americans. We love First Nations people. But then when I mentioned, and I love being connected to the people directly, they were shocked. I mentioned how I grew up seeing movies of the Cherokee Kid with Sinbad, showing my age, by fourth and fifth grade. But I also read the books about the Negro Cowboys, and I also read the books about what happened in Indian country with the Afro natives. That was normal for me. And I also told the kids part of the reason that they were so shocked, and this was told to me, was because they only knew about how great Andrew Jackson was. They didn't know that when Andrew Jackson became president, he led a vicious campaign of Indian removal policies. And they definitely, when they heard about it, they did not know that Andrew Jackson also went after the Seminoles because of the fact that African Americans, particularly Gullies, were fleeing down. And they had been going down to Spanish Florida for generations. They didn't know that. So it was a really risky thing for me to take it there and say, I'm risking your wrath, really the wrath of your parents, because you're not used to knowing that I am also a legitimate face. One expression, we're not all one size, but I'm a legitimate face of the people that you felt that you were learning about. And it was hard to find some support at times because of other natives who unfortunately were bothered by the very idea that you could be African, any number of First Nations. But I know that you guys have been doing amazing work in making that space and pushing that conversation. And I really appreciate the encouragement you all have been to help educators to, what's the saying? If you're not invited to a table, break the legs off.
Oh, that's
Hello.
not it.
Hey, but that worked for me.
Wendy.
That's the reason why I don't get invited back to a lot of
Robert
places
Foreman,
too.
I think, said that. Something
Okay,
along those lines,
Wendy.
something close.
Yeah, hey, Elizabeth.
I want to throw something in here real quick. Okay, go ahead, Ann.
As a classroom teacher here in Oklahoma, we have to deal with current legislation that keeps us from teaching about anything that makes any student feel uncomfortable because of their race. So we are very much limited in what we can present. As a matter of fact, the district that I teach for, Oklahoma City Public Schools, has now given us a format, a framework, a more specialized framework with dates for what we're supposed to be teaching this week, that week, or the other week. And they did that to keep us from getting into quote unquote trouble. Okay, so as you can imagine, there's a lot of uproar because we can't teach the truth. We can't even teach about the realities of what really happened during the Tulsa race riot because it may make someone feel uncomfortable. But let me press pause. Our old superintendent, Dr. McDaniel, told us to go ahead and tell the truth. We have a new superintendent right now. I'm pretty sure she's going to say the same thing. But what I'm trying to relate is that there's a lot of legal issues going on here in Oklahoma with our crazy ass state superintendent. And he's just making it hard for us to teach. Now, let me say this. I grew up in a household where our Native history was taught at home. I grew up in a household where our African history was taught on home. That's what they did on Saturdays or any other time we had questions. As a former AME church pastor, we did a lot of that at our church. Okay, and that's historical, going back, for well over 100 years, because the AME churches were also used to teach the blacks. Okay, so what I'm trying to say basically is we've just got to go back to having our own home-based schools, or community-based schools, Saturday schools, kind of like your Jewish communities. Okay, you teach about your heritage and your culture to your own, because with
Yeah.
this climate that we're in, I mean, that's our hands are being tied.
And the
Yeah.
question you asked before, I know I'm probably preaching to the converted, but I'm going to say it anyway. I know you've read stuff by Art Burton.
Yes.
Goodness, deep respect for him. And I'll just put out some of my own business out here. I read Black, Red, and Deadly maybe shortly after it came out. Maybe I was about 42 when I read it. It's one of the few books I read immediately twice.
Uh-huh.
So like I said, I was 42 when I read it. It turned me into this 8-year-old kid again.
It'll do that.
Because it was good guys and bad guys. And they were all us. I mean, like I said, when I stopped reading, I immediately went back to page 1 and I was like, oh goodness, anything that Art writes, definitely check it out. But I also want to mention something too, showing my age. One of the few times they implied this on TV when I was coming up, the old series Daniel Boone, and Daniel Boone himself, I know, are Shawnee relatives and others got issues with, but be that as I may, Brock Peters actually played in one of the episodes a man which is based on the real black man, Pompey, who ended up living among the Shawnee. But yeah, there was an episode that featured him going off to live among the Shawnee, which I find, looking back now as an adult, given all the garbage that was going on back then, to have something like that happening on mainstream television, that says a lot.
That says a lot. And let me say this, you're not the only one that grew up watching Daniel Boone, so. But I'm not telling my age. You just told yours. I'm not telling my age.
Two things I don't talk about: religion and a lady's age. Not necessarily that older.
You're so seasoned.
It's syndicated now, so it comes on all the time. My grandparents, I think my grandparents watched it on something, Ion television.
You can pull it up. It's
syndicated. Yeah. So I've watched Daniel Boone.
Let me say this about the atmosphere. We just had that ribbon cutting on the John Horse sign. We just renamed Highway in Wewoka. And it meant a lot to me, and I know it means a lot to everybody that traveled with John, who is John Horse, and that is Bracketville, Monsanto. That's John Horse. And so, but the idea for the sign started right here in between these ears, and it came to fruition. And so they renamed the main street that we woke up, Seminole Warrior, John Horse Memorial Highway. And we had a program and ribbon cutting. And, Saturday I didn't go out there. Sunday I went to church. And on the way back from church, I got stopped by a young lady and she said, "You seen the signs?" I said, "No." And she showed me a picture. So I immediately went out there, and it rained Saturday, so the tracks was kind of messed up. So it happened on Friday night. They tied a chain to the sign to try to drag it down. So they destroyed. They tore the sign up. And so this is the type of people that we're dealing with. And you can't, it might be a young, whoever it was, really don't know history, don't know. They probably don't know John Horse founded Wewoka. John Horse's father was an Indian and mother was black. They probably don't, but it just, and I had a council meeting last night at the council house, and Chief Lewis Johnson, he apologized for what happened, even though he didn't do it, but he understood the disrespect that we feel by what happened. But this sometimes we're in an atmosphere that people are not ready or are not even willing to learn. So that's why his question, Mr. Gabriel, his question is so important, because your delivery or to get the information or to even start a conversation, some people have walls up and which is walled up by racism, walled up with hatred. And some of these people, we will not ever be able to reach out and touch. And that racism that we're dealing with is taught. It's taught. And so we're dealing with a beast But we have I thank God, and I know God is a sovereign God and he controls all. But the days are getting brighter. And I can only imagine what my people went through. But I
Right.
understand some of the way that they tell us how they was down there in Little River. I live in Little River right now. That's where I live, where a lot of lands were a lot. I'm down there. Uh, and back in the day, couldn't no white man even go down there at all because they still was in war. Their mind was stuck on war from 200 or 300 years of war in Florida. And so when they got here, they still was in that mindset, and they stuck together. So whatever it is, whatever happened, had to happen. And I thank God, but we're still here today. And so we have to do what we have to do today because we are making history today. And so, like I say, I see everybody. I know Wendy, I know Jerry, I know Karina, I know I see Doc Harrington, the doctor there. I see Gabriel. I see you, Miss Ann. We all are standing up, and so that's what it's all about: is just standing up for the truth, and we have
Yes.
to stick together. Yeah.
If I can say something to that, because I've been really encouraged listening. One thing I think is interesting is that as much as people like to talk about things for not saying you're saying this, but as much as other people like to talk about U.S. history as if it's a Disney movie, and we all had lived, and the founding fathers talked about the Declaration of Independence, and we all live happily ever after. The reality is that you cannot truly talk about the experience of First Nations peoples without actually talking at some point about that slave trade. One thing that I did with students recently that's been really sticking to my mind, whenever, especially in this political climate, so people can go there, they were used to hearing things such as how anything south of the border was negative. So it was already a lot when I mentioned, by the way, you do have people, good old Seminoles, the Negros Muskogos, you have them right down there in Mexico. That was a lot for them to handle. But when I brought up and said, by the way, they also, many went down there because they were trying to flee the slave catchers in regards to the Fugitive Slave Act. I believe, is it 1828? When I brought that history up, it changed the perception of Mexico. Many of them, when they had to draw maps, said, we never thought that Mexico had an underground railroad, and we certainly didn't think that there were actual natives on that railroad, and that there were people who were native and black. It was enough for us to be excited just to talk about natives, but we weren't ready for that connection and the reality that people had to come together. And I know, Lonnie, you can speak to this distant mentor of mine, the late Dr. William Katz. He spoke about this extensively in his book, Black Indians, and several other works. And I remember him saying, as much as he likes to be invited to large academic circles, his main battleground was that classroom. That classroom. I had to go Bible for people. It wasn't that Pharaoh was willing to let the people go. What really got him upset was when he had to let the kids go. I want y'all to leave. Just keep the kids behind. But y'all go out and leave. And that's kind of how it seems right now. Once the kids have their minds changed, you can't stop that. And I'm noticing that their minds have to be geared to hear about at least the Black Seminole experience by first learning about the reality of slavery. And to me, I know, Lonnie, you've shared about some of that, how it's not just about talking about the slave history aspect. It's about talking about how slave societies were legitimate societies. They were a new type of connection where people could come from several backgrounds and be something new. Bringing an honor to how we talk about that has been encouraging to me because it's made me realize this is how you let people sell. When you start, if I say my great grandmother was a slave, I've seen so many say, I don't want to talk about that because slavery means negative. And I've had to tell young adults, your great grandmother, when I say she was enslaved, that also means she was brilliant. That also means she knows several different crafts. That also means she also knew several different indigenous languages because of how many times she had to work with other tribes, most likely. They're not used to being told that story. And I know, Lonnie, you said that's part of why every time you give greetings, you speak the dialect so people can hear.
Right.
Our ancestors actually did these things and they were quite brilliant. I mean, am I making sense what I'm saying, by the way?
You sound like you've been hanging around me too much, but I've told you that before.
I have. I have. Grades have been coming through.
There's
It's
one thing that
distinguishedness. It's
am
me
I
being
on here?
distinguished.
Oh, go ahead. Well, you know, is another thing that we don't ever talk about is that the native slavery, the red Indians, their slavery. That's
Right.
another shock and awe.
Right.
They don't know that they was enslaved
That's
first.
right. That's right.
And yeah, it says one African slave was worth 10 Indian slaves.
They
But
couldn't take it. Yeah.
that's right. You know, so I mean, these are things that are not ever been thought about. They don't have even the perception or nothing in their minds or never, you know, so it's some shock and awe in our stories if we tell the truth.
Yes, sir.
And there's a
And
competition.
that's what they're fighting against, is us telling the truth.
Yeah.
And
Well, it get a little bit corny, but from the movie, you can't handle the truth.
That's it.
well, Lonnie, you spoke about it too. That there's a competition that you maybe I'm the only one that's experienced this of late, because even with talking about the Seminole story, there is that other side of things with people from the Caribbean that may come over and speak dismissively of both the African American experience, the Black Seminole experience, and for that matter, the experience of many of their ancestors who joined the Seminoles. You know, have you found it that is? I know we talked about it one time how because there was such a dismissal of the African aspect of our ancestry, that has been a push to focus entirely on the African ancestry to the point where it may erase not just the native history that we carry, but erase the opportunity to discuss the native slave trade that was present. Tuscarora slave trade, want to add on to that, that happened on top of the slave trade that happened with the Creek. You know, because of the dismissal toward the Black side, it seems that people have, in some ways, willing to, you know, say, you know, we don't need the fine, we don't need them. Leave the natives alone. We're just 100% African. I know that's something you've talked about before with knowing how to share more about that.
Yeah, I talked about it briefly earlier on when I started the presentation this evening. I didn't go into great detail, but I talked about how unfortunately some of our, well, the other side of our Black heritage, because of divide and conquer tactics that have existed in a myriad of forms over the centuries, had this attitude that if you try to honor anything else other than your Black heritage, you weren't proud of being Black. And I know certainly in my case and many of us here, you know, on this forum this evening, nothing could be further from the truth, because most of us were raised to be proud of everything that we are. So yeah, I don't find it as prevalent anymore, but it still does exist in some circles. So yeah, that's something we still need to address and try to correct, where those of our relatives that have this, yeah, and I'm going to go there, backward attitude, need to rethink things, because everything is relevant. You know, we're a rainbow people. There are many different factions that came together to make us who we are, and we stand on those shoulders.
Hey, I see Dr. Tinney has a question.
Yes, ma'am.
Hi, this has been so wonderful this evening, Wendy, and thank you, Lonnie Harrington. I'm so happy to say that you were one of the supporters I was waiting to meet, and thank you so much for supporting Florida Black Historical Research Project.
And again, ma'am, I thank you for putting up with me all these years.
And
all my crazy emails.
Thank you for mentioning our home area. And of course, since I'm from that area, I do appreciate your, talking about the Dania area. But of course, I'm from West Palm Beach, which is a little different. And I want to thank also Chief Barkas and Gabriel Greaves and Mr. Anolfi. Everything that everybody is saying is so interesting about this history. What I don't as much have a question as I would like to say that everybody here has made some really excellent points about what is happening. And one of the major points was the last point made, which is that they don't want us to tell our own history. And that's really, really very important. But one of the things that bothers me is that the history is much longer than the 19th century. Everybody seems to focus on. What I'd like us to think about is trying to recreate the history before the 19th century, the history of the intermingling of these people, because one of the things I do know is that, and I mentioned this at another meeting, that there were Black, Native, Indigenous people here. Now, this is in the white people's history books that they saw these Black-skinned people in Mexico and the Yamasee people. They all claim to have been very dark people. And I read a biography by a white woman in one of her enslaved people said that met a Native American, and she was shocked to see that the person was of a lighter complexion because all the Native Americans she'd ever seen were dark skinned. So that what we need to do, I'd like to see us, as Chief Barkus mentioned, go back to looking at the period when the Native Americans were summarily hunted down for enslavement before that time, during that time, because this is a time when there was a different kind of thing going. Before that time, there was a different thing. And I have read things like the Chichimecas, who were from Mexico, who were in Mexican records I've read in Spanish, were very Black-skinned people. So that I think the Native American population here was accustomed to dark-skinned people. This was not their first time to see dark-skinned people when the Americans finally, in the 18th century and the late 17th century, started wholesaling, bringing in people from Africa. These people were already accustomed to seeing dark-skinned Native American people. I think we have the fight of the movie industry. The movie industry created what the Native American looked like. So we can't hold Trump and the rest of the people too responsible for their ignorance, because most of us were educated. I was a child. I could see my grandmother every day, but most of us were educated to believe that what a Native American person looked like by the movies. And that's the fact of life. And those movies are not going to go anywhere, but at least nobody's showing them as much today, but they're still there. And we still have to contend with that. I think what we're doing now is so important. We have the same thing in Florida with people trying to make our country an ignorant place to be. And I don't think that's going to work, because the more they try to make people ignorant, the more they try to learn things. So I think as long as we continue with Lonnie and Chief Barkus, I'm so sorry about what happened with the sign. Gabriel, thank you for what you're doing. It's so beautiful, and all the rest of you, so hard to keep our history alive and to keep, to keep the, but if you can get people to learn these languages, to learn Spanish, to learn, Portuguese, to learn German, to learn these languages, to learn the Dutch language, all of these different languages, so we can read those records, because in those records, we're going to find some of the hidden history that we don't know. Thank you, Wendy.
Did you also
Yes,
want to
ma'am.
mention
If I can just add
January,
oh, I'm sorry.
Dr. Tinney? Did she mute herself?
Oh, I'm sorry. What is it?
Did you want to mention January? I saw you put
I
it in the
put
chat.
it in the chat. that yes, every January we have this remembrance of the set of the people who lived at Loxahatchee River and were uh, attacked by the infantry, by the Americans, and removed, and had to be removed from there. And it's now been officially recognized historically as a battlefield and has national recognition. I, you know, I, I'm really the whole idea of the battlefield because too much for me. But it was a village where people lived, and so that we try to remember that, and we try to remember also the soldiers who fought there uh, through no fault of their own. We do that every year during the Martin Luther King weekend on that Sunday, and uh, sometimes we have an event on Saturday or Friday. But we'd be happy to send you our information, and I did put that information in the chat. Thank you. Thank you, Wendy.
Thank you.
And Dr. Cheney, if I could
No
just pick on
problem.
something, if I could pick up on something you just said, earlier in the presentation, I mentioned the Huntington Free Library, which used to be located here in the Bronx, and exactly what you're saying is true. It was one of the best facilities to do research on anything indigenous, but a lot of the stuff was in Spanish and in Portuguese. So yeah, not being multilingual like that did cut down on some of the being able to take advantage of that resource. But yeah, the more that we can learn, the more it can help open these doors. So I definitely hear what you're saying. And by the way, I call Hollywood Hollyweird, by the way.
Yes, yes, that's a good name.
Referring to California, not the res. Still got some folks on the res. I don't want them come looking for
Yes.
me now.
Isn't
Oh,
Hollywood?
yeah.
Isn't Hollywood where you grew up, Lonnie?
No,
Was
I
not
actually
Hollywood?
Dania, which is next to Hollywood. And when I was a boy, my mother would take me to the res, which is still known as Dania. But no, I didn't actually grow up there. I've got a cousin who goes back and forth between there and Texas now, but I'm not going to talk about his antics right now.
Well, all the cousins. Well, but that point, with Spanish, even as opposed to learn languages, even with Spanish, when you were speaking, it made me think about the experience of the Spanish Seminoles.
I spoke about that briefly earlier in the presentation, just in terms of my bloodline, because there was a Spanish Seminole named Maria, who my mother met, but I'm not sure how she fits in, but I do know she's a relative and an ancestor. But, you and I have had these discussions about the distinct history of the Spanish Seminoles.
Yeah, and with the fishing communities, I believe in Cuba and Puerto Rico. And it's interesting is that what you guys have all been saying, it makes me think I could be off. In my experience, sometimes people can be super excited to talk about the experience of natives, but that bias against immigrants. Man, I love talking about indigenous history. What about people in the islands? Oh no, that's the Spanish folks. That's Latinos. That's Hispanics. And then I
Yeah, I still get into
part of my history.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Not so much anymore, but I still occasionally get into arguments when they don't talk about there are no indigenous people south of the Rio Grande. I mean, what are you talking about? That is one of the most dumbest things I ever heard.
Yeah, we got.
But on a much lighter note, but going back to what you're saying, hey, a lot of enrolled members of the Seminole Tribe of Florida have Spanish last names. Okay, including a lot of people work for the Atafiki Museum, the cultural center. So hey, like our Lakota relatives say, Mitakwi Yasin, we're all related.
I think if you look at some of the pictures, the early pictures of the Seminoles in Florida, or what people were calling Seminoles, so look, it's kind of, I don't know. I mean, you can see that there was a great deal of mixture. I guess that's the best way to put it.
Has anyone read, I'm sorry, has anyone read Toni Morrison's book, Have Mercy? It's fiction, but she talks about it as a story about America before America became America, Or she also said that it was a story about before people were raced, before we were told who we were. And I just, it's in the idea of studying the history of how races came together. I know she did a lot of research about this because she writes about it so beautifully, how you can just walk up to somebody, you didn't care, what their skin looked like or anything, until there was the idea that you could put me in a position where you now own me. So now it's important to separate people. But it's really been like the best account of sort of how race was made, even though it's fictionalized. So I don't know if I know of a nonfiction book that kind of illustrates it, as clearly as she did in that book.
There's academic treatments of the subject, but they're boring.
Maybe that's it. But no.
But yes, it's true. You go back far enough, and they might record that people look different, but they don't make any particular, comments about it.
I mean, my mother, she was born and raised in Panama, along with my aunts, grandparents, and our roots also go back to Jamaica, respectively, the Corbanti, Barbados, which is also connected with the Arawak, and of course Guyana. But what's funny is that while we were aware of the mixture and we were thankful for our African roots, it was never a question in our mind that the First Nations people there had reddish brown, dark cinnamon, or bronze skin tones, because we saw that. But because of the conversation of race being tied to the governments giving out the definitions for who could qualify, you had people being pitted against each other. Like the old assimilation policy with conquistadors coming through, taking over the people, then choosing one or two of the people to represent for the whole and say, well, we're part of the empire, and if we made it, you can too. Oh, by the way, those people over there, they look like they're dark as a pavement. They're not one of us anymore. It changed. It has changed, and that's something that unfortunately it still leaves an impact. Like in the island of Bahamas, particularly in the Andros and Red Bay. And I know Lonnie, we talked about that before I went back to go actually connect 2022. They still have to deal with people that assume, well, they may be darker in complexion because they were mixed, when that is an aspect of it, but they also had lots of people in the island who actually looked just as it did because they were from the Americas, and melanin is not something located just in Africa. And I know I went to Japan, saw the same thing. I saw, believe it or not, melanated peoples in Hokkaido, saw the photos. Up there, they're aware of it, they just don't care. But it's the same principle playing out here in the States when it comes to teaching. We still think, as was mentioned earlier, so lovely, the way it was said, that one level of acceptance in teaching is helping people to know that admixture has happened, like the late Jack D. Forbes mentioned in his book, Africans and Natives, Africans and Native Americans. Yes, admixture was a normal thing in Latin America before it hit North America. But before that, melanated peoples, cinnamon peoples, that was normal in Central South America and the islands. And that's an uphill battle still. That it can drain. And like Wendy, you were saying, I mean, that it spoke to me a lot because that's honestly my lived experience, where you feel like you live in a world of binary ideologies. People say you're either this or that, not both and.
Yeah.
And if you mention I'm both and plus, you become an automatic threat because you force people to have conversations. And the people that don't want to have conversations, even if they say they're indigenous, they happen to benefit from maintaining the binary.
Oh, yeah.
Not letting us be who we are.
Yeah. Hey, Miss Elizabeth, I saw you had your hand raised.
Yes. I've got a good friend, Dr. Paul Lehman, Lehman. He wrote a piece, and actually he later turned it into a book, but it was dealing with the same, just along with Isabel Wilkerson. But Dr. Lehman's, I think his book is titled America's Race Problem. I know he has something on WordPress under the same, it may just be an essay, a precursor to his book, but he talked about that issue. And then along came Isabel Wilkerson in her book, of course, Caste, which talks about how we got into the classification of race and how one deemed to be better than another. Because you're right, at one point in time, it was just about being human beings, but we're no longer there. That's all I had to say.
And what Gabriel was saying, I think is true, is that I think it is up to us to always not ever have to choose between, are you Black, are you Seminole? It is totally possible to highlight our Blackness. And I've actually felt a little bit different that the Seminole part was always sort of the more, highlighted part, because it was quote unquote exotic as opposed to the Black, part of us. But I think it is up to us. Thank you, Chief Marcus, to to set the tone for this. It is up to us, as members of this group. And it is an individual way of being, but also collectively. We're all here on this Zoom tonight because we all care about our history and how best to move forward, and we want to learn from our do I call you an elder, Lonnie? I don't know.
I've been called worse, but yeah, I'm a used car. Hey, I'm an old guy. Bottom line.
Sometimes I feel like you have more energy than me. But just to learn from people who know more. I would say that's what it breaks down to. We keep having these conversations, and something good has got to come from all of this. There's a lot going on. What happened in Wewoka after the sign is just tragic. It just shows you that, there's progress, but there's always someone there who wants to take that progress away. So, what do? We put that sign back up. I hope that that's the plan. I think that's what we've always done. So, I think just us being here is a testament to us still being here. I think that's what I've always said about us as Black Seminoles, is that we're still here. There's been so much that could have taken us all out, and look, we're all still here.
Let me jump in on the sign issue. Even though I'm here in Indian Territory, I'm here in Oklahoma, I haven't had a chance to speak to those who are here yet. But as I was telling another one of our sisters, this can be an opportunity if we use it right. It could be an opportunity to educate. It could be an opportunity to rally for support, get some additional advocacy. So, we're in the early stages. It's my understanding that, it's still under investigation. For those of you who don't know, I'm a retired law enforcement officer, so I've got an investigative background and a supervisory background. But I'm just kind of waiting to see. I know Lee had an interest too, as Lee Young. Of course, he's got his background with the Rangers. But we're just kind of watching and seeing what Lighthorse does, and the sheriff's office. But, from back when I was working, that was considered a hate crime under federal law. And, that is a reservation, which falls under federal jurisdiction. But like I said, it's going to be interesting to see what the people want to do. I know what I want to do, but it's not the time right now. So I think we need to come to a consensus and see what the investigation shows. But this could be an opportunity if we work it right.
Exactly.
On a slightly lighter note, but it's historically relevant, I want to bring up something. And again, I'm probably preaching to the converted, but you mentioned Mr. Young. I find it interesting. And I remember, even though I wasn't aware of him at the time, I remember when he first became a Texas Ranger, it was national news. But the Rangers got their butts kicked by our ancestors too when they came down into, over the border into Nashville when they bringing that mess. Back.
They did.
So ironically enough, there's some karma cosma going on there with respect to Mr. Young.
There he
You
is.
don't mess with our ancestors, man.
And I was in the army, so yeah, we kicked the army's ass. So I mean, it's like, hey.
Oh yeah. Oh, by the way, although I didn't serve, my father was career Army. So
okay.
Can I say something what is making me think about right now, as a trained interdisciplinary researcher by trade and historian, one of the things that one of my mentors mentioned with learning moments is that the work of historians, even with the things that are unfortunate, the work of historians is to collect receipts, to do photojournalism, to document, to be there on the front lines and just listen to people, even if it's nothing momentous, 24/7, just being present. And part of that being present is creating grassroots libraries, grassroots scholarship. That's one of the things we do with the website that help administer on ancestral healing, where we have, people from all over the country, all over the world, actually, Indigenous First Nations people from across the continent of Africa, sharing their stories, and then also books and sharing the experiences. And when y'all was sharing about that sign, it made me think it would be a sin to only talk about how the sign, as long as it took the place up, it will be a sin to only mention how the sign was placed up and not document how people responded when the sign got attacked. Because as much as it pains me to say it, that sign being attacked tells me and many others that somebody knew the truth was getting out. Somebody was getting comfortable, and somebody had to go and do a preemptive strike, hoping that it would intimidate people, not realizing it's going to flip on you.
Right.
That's gotten you more fuel. Now you're just part of history. You think you've made more history. You give it more room for us to talk about the continual ongoing struggle.
Right.
And I really appreciate you guys, even with this conversation, doing that, because I remember seeing many elders who complain about young adults not knowing the truth. But when you ask the elders who share the things that happen, not just the good stuff, but the bad stuff, many were reluctant to share. And then realize what this new generation needs is courage to know that it is dangerous. Being completely forthright, it is dangerous to speak directly about how people don't want to hear the truth. But it's also what young adults need to see, because they need to know, here's what it's going to look like if it's going to take several generations to that sign coming up. Correct me if I'm wrong, and Lonnie, you can speak to me about it too, but correct me if I'm wrong. People were advocating for that sign since they were kids, and their grandparents were advocating for it. So that was a generations long struggle to get John Force's name out there, right?
And Chief Barkas, who's not with, they could actually elaborate a lot better than I can on that.
Yeah, I spoke with Chief Barkas about it. He said it's definitely been the last couple of years that they've been trying to get the sign up.
Well, that tells me, like, okay, if it took that long and that was that quick of an attack, every single adult needs to see that.
And that's the crazy thing is that, it took years to get the sign, and it was down, like you said, at least by Friday, when it had gone up. So
okay, and that was news to me. I thought it was 2 days.
Yeah, I didn't realize that either. Yeah,
that quick.
So that's incredibly sad. Just it makes no sense.
So it got torn down the same day it went up.
Yeah, that's what it sounds like.
Yeah,
I have to go.
One thing, one more thing, Wendy, I'd like us to think about too is, Lonnie talked about it a bit, redefining going back to the original meaning of Seminole. We need to spend a little more time on that. Self-referencing ourselves as Black Seminoles. Well, I don't do that. When I do the maroon, which is the same thing, but it just is not in today's language. So it does kind of diminish the thing a bit, because Seminole was more than just these people who claimed the title, because it was nobody's name. So that it was a word that was used to refer to all those people, Black, yellow, green, purple, whatever colors they were. So it was not related to people who happened to be accepted by certain people. so that I
And to
can.
that point, Dr. Tinney,
Oh,
I know for a fact, okay, the term Seminole was used more and more, especially up till the First War, but still, and I've seen documentation in the leading up to the Second War, many of those relatives, no matter what shade they were still identifying themselves by town and not calling themselves Seminoles. By
right.
the Second War, we pretty much started to accept each other. And interesting enough, I haven't been back now in like 30 years, but my few trips back to the reservation in Hollywood, not that I was part of conversations, but overhearing something, you hear them, especially among the older folks, they still would refer to themselves to specific towns going back. So yeah, there's a lot of strength in what you're saying. You know, we didn't accept that term for us at first. We identified ourselves by town.
And how would they identify it by town? Like, how would they?
Okay, the Oconee or Paliklakaha, which is Abraham's
Mulatto.
town.
Okay.
Mulatto woman's town. Okay.
Yeah.
Oh goodness. Alachua. Okay, Miccosukee. These were all
Okay.
town names, et cetera, et cetera. But by the Second War, we decided to, for whatever reason, we accepted that term for us. But no,
Yeah.
I even saw certain documents from the U.S. Army is still identifying the different bands by town names.
Mm.
Which is
Wow.
weird because so many people say, well, you're not really part of the Seminole people if you didn't live on an Indian country in the reservations, when the fact is that we had a town-to-town relationship.
You're thinking rationally again, Gabriel. I told you about that, man.
Try not to, but it's hard. But it's
You're going to end up like me. I keep telling you that, man.
I'm gonna keep
My hair was your
I'm gonna
color
keep the
once.
color in mind. No, I told someone recently when someone said, well, they said, well, I wish maybe it'd be a good thing to acknowledge that the Black Seminoles are a subgroup of Seminoles. I said, no.
Mm.
No.
Yeah, like that's weird.
Yeah. No. The Black describes the African mixed, the extra, this is the gumbo. The Blackness is a beautiful, beautiful ingredient. It's the roux for the gumbo that adds in everything else, but they always want to minimize it, and they make it seem as if they seem to really struggle with knowing that we had a town-to-town relationship, which also opened the door for people across the islands to come join us too. You know, but that's a revolutionary mind. I think it's a struggle for people to really think about that, because honestly, they don't know how to interact with neighbors.
Yeah.
You know?
But again, sort of going back to something Dr. Cheney said, I'm going to try to make a connection here when you mentioned the islands. Yeah, in spite of social turmoil, we had interactions going on all over the place. So yeah, well, I don't want to go in right now how the Miccosukes and Big Family Feud got their recognition because of the long relationship with Cuba. But no, there was interaction with the Bahamas. There was interactions with Cuba. And through Cuba, to other parts in Central and South America. So yeah, these relationships were going on.
And they were fine with it. I mean, I think that's what goes back to how the dynamic of grassroots scholarship. If you have a township to township mindset within that, a family to family network, you can do things on a locale level, making a global impact from a local level. And it doesn't phase you. But if your identity is based on having a national recognition or having it seen in big terms, you're going to miss the connections that's right in front of you.
Yeah.
I think that's why some people are afraid to share. We have people that are fearful of sharing our stories because we feel, well, there's not a large enough platform, therefore it's not important. Well, I know a lot of people that live in the hometown and lived on the block. Their grandmothers, aunties, and uncles and granddads, many may not know about them worldwide, but they're part of my hometown. You know, so it doesn't really matter if the whole world knows it in the same way they may know about a larger narrative. It still happened. And I know it's a struggle to push to make folks comfortable with that, you know?
Yeah. I mean, I think, the most important thing is, telling this story is not easy. I think we can't just rely on the simplest explanations for things, oh, let's keep it black and white. I think, what we need to teach other people who want to learn our story is that there's so much nuance within our story. That's sort of the first thing you have to do is in learning our story is kind of get rid of your biases for one, but also get rid of the idea that, it has to be a linear telling of the story, because we went to so many different places and we're still there. There are so many different diasporas.
Yeah.
But yeah, if you want to learn this story, you have to sort of get used to the idea that it's going to be not just intensive, but also extensive, and it's not just told in one sitting. So that's sort of, I think, what why people think our story is so interesting because of how complex and vast it is. But then also they kind of want us to sort of get to the point of it. And it's not that easy to do that. So if we could just figure out a way to, get people's
Tell me who your main
mindsets.
leader is. Well, we have leaders. Okay, where y'all located? Well, we have several different home bases.
Yeah. Well, we are coming on, what is this, 2 hours of conversation? And I feel like it's ongoing. This really isn't a stopping point. It's sort of just, let's put a pin in it and we will continue this conversation. Dr. Tinney, I definitely think we should discuss more. I definitely like to make a space for that. And, and I'm also very interested in just talking about our language in general. What you brought up during, I think it was the Seminole Maroon reunion in 2023 about language, saying enslaved as opposed to slaves. And I think you said it perfectly in this podcast that I heard you on. We need to decolonize our minds. That's the first thing. Because that affects how we tell our story. So, if anybody has ideas how we can do that, I think this Zoom space is good, but yeah, what's the format for that? How do we do that? I think that would be important too.
Yes. Well, I think we're getting there, but it's a slow process, and the historians are so guilty. Not, I'm not talking about anybody here, but are so guilty of using the colonizers' language to talk about us. And then we repeat what they say as if they know what they're talking about in the language that they use incorrect. So, we have a way to go, but I think we're moving in that direction, to look at the language. And already, well, you can tell people are saying enslaved now and people don't say runaway, which is what children do. They say self-emancipate, or even if it's longer, it's not quick to say, but self-emancipator is self-emancipator. I heard someone say freedom on the run, which I think is pretty good. It's better than runaway. So we have all of that. And so we're moving and decolonizing our minds.
That has definitely worked for me, Dr. Tinney, in Mexico.
Hey, which I would need to talk with you about something about that too. Get a chance.
I remember when I first changed my last name to Ali and just added that on, tacked that on to the end. And there's a whole set of circumstances surrounding that. I'm not going to go into that right now. But I had a good friend of mine, when I told him that I had changed my surname to Ali, he looked at me and he smiled and he said, "Oh, I see you freed yourself, my sister." And I laughed. And I'm like, yes, I did.
That's beautiful.
Thank you.
I had no idea. That's great.
I just added on. I tell my friends, I just need a real long line to write my full name on, because I didn't take anything away from it. I just added to it.
Well, that's another thing about our people, is that we do use all these different names from all these different cultures. Like when you get born into this thing, you'll see the people with these long names because they have to account for the time, a lot of stuff. And sometimes you're cross-cultural, so that's going to be a name. So, you know, naming is important. how we talk about ourselves. So I think, reminds me, I hate to tell you guys, but I have to hear the vice president tonight. So
we understand.
Yes, we do.
because wait a minute.
He
I
said
mean,
no punches.
We know
History's being made.
Yeah.
Sister bonding. I'm not getting in the middle of that.
So, First Lady Michelle brought smoke. So
Yes.
And I'm going to say this. Everyone give Roland Martin his due, because we could go back and rewatch it on his channel on YouTube. So.
Okay.
And put his ratings up. Yeah, because he records it. I mean, it's there. It'll be on YouTube.
Oh, okay.
And you can watch it at any time.
Great.
And that's, I really applaud him for what he's doing, because that's a potential resource I think we should take advantage of, because he's always looking for news, because that's what he does. And I think when we find ourselves in situations, if we are ready for his advocacy, that's if we're ready, because it may take it, to a whole nother level. Always consider him as a resource.
That's an interesting point you made too. If you're ready.
Thank you. That's the power of the podcast. That's, where communications are going. And we're here as a good example of that.
It's funny, by the way you mentioned it, I have to say, because I remember in class at one point when we talked about Andrew Jackson, I was having to prepare myself, being in an environment with limited Black folks, right? But when we started talking about Andrew Jackson, for a lot of the kids who had grown up hearing a lot of pro 45 rhetoric, a lot of that being pushed, and seeing the picture of Andrew Jackson in the Oval Office.
Yes.
It made me think I don't have to work. I can work, but I'm gonna work smart, not hard. All I gotta do is say, well, do you know that the person that has that picture in the Oval Office does not know about the people that same president was coming for, who happen to be my people? Now we have a learning moment.
Yes.
So I'm curious from a younger generation's perspective, what they're seeing now with the opportunities for conversation in this time frame. And I know there probably wasn't time for it, but I know, Lonnie, you brought up that kind of stuff with some of the leaders in the Black Seminole experience, some of the women leaders as well. I'm already looking at it and saying, you know what? You can have a whole bunch of stuff anchored on just with this moment of time when people are now thinking they're fearful of Black leaders as it is. So we already know that. You might have at the moment saying we're going to tell you about the whole scope of it. So let's see where it's going to go.
And I'm going to close with it. And that is what brought the sign down within a few hours. Fear.
Yeah. Yep. Fear and hatred.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, again, I want to say thank you to everybody for joining the Zoom tonight. Lonnie, you outdid yourself, so I can't thank you enough.
Yay!
Well, I want to thank everybody for putting up with me. Nah, I won't tell nobody you communicate with strange old men over the internet. It'll be our secret.
I know.
You're welcome.
Oh, Lord.
But again, thank y'all for, just this amazing evening. So many great conversations, so many places that we can now sort of go, and branch off. I think a lot of good is coming from this. No matter
since I can't type that fast, Karina, I hope to see you soon too.
Yeah, I saw that. Yeah, in
Thank
Texas.
you.
That's in Texas. That's the caveat. So you gotta come and visit.
I'm gonna try to go. I'm really I said I was going, so I should be there. So
awesome.
Good.
So yeah, thank you everyone. And I feel like this conversation is ongoing. So, thank you for being a part of it. A lot of great thoughts and words were spoken tonight. So just thank you. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
All right, y'all.
That was awesome.
Have a good evening, everyone.
Have a good one.
Bye, y'all.
Bye.
All right.
Bye, everybody.